She was selling daisies to buy medicine, until a millionaire CEO stopped and changed her life forever. The street was quiet except for the occasional hum of cars rushing past, their headlights casting fleeting shadows across the cracked pavement. On the edge of the sidewalk, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, Lily Johnson sat with her small knees drawn close together, balancing an old, battered box on her lap. Inside it lay the only thing she had to offer the world, daisies, plucked with care earlier that day, their white petals glowing faintly in the cold night air. She arranged them neatly as though the effort alone might make them more appealing to strangers who hurried by with their collars turned up against the chill. Her sky-blue dress, once bright but now faded from wear, clung thinly to her little frame and did nothing to keep out the biting wind that tugged at her blonde hair and sent it across her pale cheeks. She sat there with the quiet determination of someone far older than 5 years, her small fingers gripping the box as though letting go of it would mean surrendering hope itself. Every passerby seemed to tower over her, their footsteps echoing against the concrete, but most did not even glance her way. Those who did offered a quick, dismissive smile before continuing on, their hands stuffed deep into pockets, unwilling to part with even a coin. Lily's lips trembled slightly, but she kept her chin high, whispering to herself that she must not cry. Crying, she believed, would only make her weaker, and she had to be strong for her mother. Her mother's face lingered in her mind with painful clarity, the fever, the shallow breathing, the way her once warm hands had turned clammy and weak. The doctor had spoken words Lily didn't fully understand, but she had grasped enough. Medicine was needed, and medicine cost money. So Lily had done the only thing she could think of. She had gathered daisies, flowers her mother once loved, and she had come here to sell them. To others they might look like weeds, but to her they were lifelines, each petal a step closer to saving the only family she had left. The night grew colder, the damp air settling into her bones. She hugged her arms around herself for warmth, glancing at the sparse bouquet of daisies, willing them to vanish from the box so she might carry money instead. Her bare feet shifted on the concrete, numb from the chill, but she stayed rooted in place. In her mind she pictured bringing coins home, imagined the relief on her mother's tired face, and told herself that tomorrow would be better if only someone would buy. Hours dragged by with little change. The sky had already darkened into a deep navy blue, the stars blurred by the thin mist drifting in from the river, and Lily's eyelids began to grow heavy. Still she fought against the weight of exhaustion, jerking her head upright each time it dipped forward, terrified that if she fell asleep she would miss the one person willing to stop. When footsteps finally slowed nearby, she straightened at once, clutching the box with renewed urgency. A tall figure in a light gray suit paused at the curb, the glow from a nearby streetlight outlining the broadness of his shoulders and the calm, deliberate way he carried himself. His hair was dark brown, his eyes an impossible shade of blue that seemed to pierce straight through the dim light. He looked out of place against the shabby street, more suited to a glass tower than the cracked pavement where Lily sat. For a brief second she thought he would walk on like all the others, but instead he lingered, his gaze settling on her in a way that made her heart pound. Lily swallowed, her voice barely a whisper as she lifted a daisy from the box and held it out with trembling fingers. "Would you like to buy a flower, sir?" she asked, her tone quiet but steady, carrying every ounce of hope she had left. The man did not answer immediately. He crouched down so that his eyes were level with hers, his expression unreadable but softened by something she couldn't quite name. He studied the small girl before him, the thin dress, the weary eyes, the fragile determination, and for the first time that night, Lily felt truly seen. Richard Hayes had not planned to stop on that street. His car had been waiting a block away, the driver ready to take him home after yet another endless meeting that blurred together with the dozens before it. Usually, he walked with his eyes fixed ahead, mind occupied with figures, contracts, and the pressure of keeping a global company afloat. But tonight, something in the corner of his vision pulled him away from that rhythm. At first he thought the small figure hunched beneath the streetlight was nothing more than a shadow or a bundle of forgotten rags. Only when he drew closer did he realize it was a child, and not just a child but a girl so young she looked impossibly fragile against the unforgiving concrete. He slowed, his polished shoes striking sharply against the pavement, the sound carrying in the stillness of the night. The girl startled at the noise, clutching her box to her chest as though someone might snatch it from her. Her wide blue eyes looked up at him, wary but not pleading, and that expression unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He was used to people asking for things, money, favors, opportunities. This child did not beg. She simply held out a daisy, her hand trembling from the cold, and offered it with a whisper that seemed to carry more strength than it should have. "Would you like to buy a flower, sir?" Richard crouched down so he could meet her gaze. Up close, he could see how thin she was, how her dress barely clung to her shoulders, how her lips were cracked from the wind. His instinct was to ask where her parents were, but he stopped himself. There was something in her eyes, a mix of exhaustion and stubborn will, that told him she had already endured far more than any child should. Instead he asked quietly, "Why are you out here so late?" "It's cold." The girl shifted, pulling the box closer, as if guarding it. "I need money for medicine," she whispered, her voice hoarse, almost breaking. "My mom is sick. I have to help." She lowered her gaze then, as though ashamed, and Richard felt the words hit him harder than any accusation. He thought of the countless times he had signed off donations, checks to charities he would never visit, gestures that required no more effort than a signature. And here was a child, 5 years old at most, sitting in the cold because her mother's life depended on it. For a long moment he said nothing. The city continued on around them, cars passing, lights blinking in windows, but Richard's focus narrowed until there was nothing except the girl and the trembling flowers in her lap. He reached out, carefully, and lifted the box slightly, examining the daisies. They were plain, ordinary, not the kind of flowers anyone in his world would glance at twice. Yet when he looked back at her, the sight of those simple blossoms felt heavier than any luxury bouquet he had ever purchased. "I'll buy them all," he said at last, his voice firm but gentle. The girl blinked, her mouth parting in surprise. All of them?" "Yes. Every flower you have," Richard replied, already reaching for his wallet. He pulled out a stack of bills far exceeding the worth of the daisies, not caring what it looked like, not caring if it made sense. He pressed the money into her small hands, folding her fingers around it so she wouldn't try to refuse. "This is for your mother's medicine," he added softly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She looked down at the bills as though they were something unreal, then back up at him, her lips trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, the words so fragile they seemed almost too heavy for her to carry. "You'll save her. You really will." Richard felt something twist in his chest at the certainty in her tone. She believed him, believed that his act could save her mother, and in that moment he realized this was not just a transaction. It was a lifeline. He took the box of daisies from her lap, holding it carefully, though he knew it wasn't the flowers he had truly purchased. It was the unspoken promise in her eyes, the faith she had placed in a stranger who had stopped when no one else had. For the first time in years, Richard Hayes felt the weight of responsibility not for a company, not for a deal, but for a single child who had looked at him and seen hope. Richard walked away from that street with the box of daisies in his hands, but he didn't head directly to his car. Instead, he slowed his steps, glancing back at the little girl who still sat on the curb, clutching the money he had given her as though it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Something inside him refused to let the moment end there. He was used to quick resolutions, to closing deals and moving on, but this was different. The look in her eyes when she had whispered, "You'll save her," had carved itself into his mind, and he could not shake the feeling that if he left her now, she would disappear back into the shadows of the city, just another forgotten child trying to survive. He turned and walked back, crouching down once more so that their eyes met. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The girl hesitated, her lips pressed tight, but then she answered, "Lily." The name seemed too delicate for the harshness of the world she lived in, yet it suited her, fragile but enduring. Richard nodded slowly, repeating it as though committing it to memory. "Lily. That's a beautiful name." She tilted her head, studying him carefully, as though she couldn't quite understand why a man like him, a stranger in an immaculate suit, would stop to speak with her at all. Richard felt the urge to ask a dozen questions: where she lived, how long she had been out there, why no one was helping her, but he forced himself to keep his tone steady, to avoid overwhelming her. Instead he said, "I'd like to help you and your mother. Can you show me where she is?" Lily's eyes widened, and for a moment her whole body went rigid. It was clear she had learned not to trust easily, that every offer of help carried the risk of disappointment. Her little hands tightened around the money, her knuckles pale, but then she gave the smallest nod. "She's at the hospital," she whispered. "She's really sick." Richard extended his hand, waiting patiently. "Then let's go together," he said. She looked at his hand for a long time, her expression torn between caution and hope. Finally, with a trembling breath, she slid her small fingers into his palm. The contact was feather-light at first, as though she was ready to pull away at any second, but as they began to walk, her grip grew firmer, as if she was testing the truth of his promise step by step. They reached his car, a sleek vehicle that stood out on the rundown street like a foreign object. The driver looked at Richard in surprise when he saw the child at his side, but Richard silenced him with a glance. He opened the door himself and helped Lily climb inside, careful not to rush her. She sank into the leather seat, her teddy bear clutched against her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar space. For a few moments she said nothing, and the hum of the engine filled the silence as they pulled away from the curb. Then, almost too softly to hear, she asked, "Why did you stop?" The question caught Richard off guard. He considered all the answers he could give, that he had money to spare, that it was the right thing to do, but none of them felt true enough. Finally he said, "Because you shouldn't have to be out there alone. No child should." She studied him with wide, searching eyes, and though she didn't reply, the faintest shift in her posture suggested that his words had reached her. As the car moved through the city streets, Richard felt the daisies resting on his lap. Their simple fragrance filled the air, mingling with the quiet presence of the child beside him. He realized then that he had bought far more than flowers that night. He had stepped into a story he could not walk away from, a story that would demand more of him than he had ever given anyone. And though he did not yet understand how deeply it would change him, a quiet certainty settled in his chest: he would see it through, for Lily's sake. The hospital loomed ahead, its tall windows glowing faintly in the night, a mixture of sterile light and muted shadows. Richard had been in hospitals before, though usually for quick executive checkups or to visit colleagues. Never had he walked into one carrying the weight of a child's trembling hand in his own. Lily clung to him as they crossed the entrance, her small steps echoing against the polished tile floor. She looked fragile against the vast, cold halls, her yellow shirt too thin for the chill inside, her pajama pants brushing against the ground. Her teddy bear was pressed so tightly to her chest that its stitched seams seemed to strain under the pressure. The nurses behind the reception desk gave Richard a curious glance, recognizing him perhaps from newspapers or television, but it was the sight of Lily that silenced their questions. She tugged on Richard's sleeve and pointed toward a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. "She's there," she whispered. Her voice cracked, as though speaking about her mother's condition made it more real. Richard squeezed her hand gently, guiding her forward, each step pulling him deeper into the unknown terrain of responsibility he had never expected to claim. When they entered the room, the air was thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic. Machines beeped softly, the sound a steady reminder of life being measured in fragile beats. On the bed lay Anna Johnson, Lily's mother, her figure frail beneath the thin hospital blanket. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her skin pale and damp with fever. Even without medical training, Richard could see she was losing strength. He felt Lily tense beside him, her small body going rigid as she whispered, "Mom." Anna stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering open. The effort of focusing seemed enormous, but when her gaze finally landed on her daughter, the faintest trace of warmth touched her tired features. "Lily," she murmured, her voice hoarse, barely more than air. Lily rushed forward, climbing onto the chair beside the bed, her tiny fingers clutching her mother's hand. Richard stayed back for a moment, giving them space, but when Anna's eyes shifted toward him, he stepped closer, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. "Who?" she asked weakly, her gaze darting between him and her daughter. "I'm Richard Hayes," he said softly, keeping his tone low and steady. "I found Lily outside. She told me you needed help. I've arranged for your treatment to be covered. The doctors will give you everything you need." Anna blinked slowly, tears forming in the corners of her tired eyes. She looked at Lily again, who nodded eagerly. "He bought all my flowers, Mama. He's going to help you." For a long moment, Anna seemed to fight for words, her lips trembling. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Her hand, weak and trembling, squeezed her daughter's fingers before slipping limply back onto the bed. Richard stepped closer to reassure her, speaking quietly with the doctor who arrived moments later. The doctor explained that her condition was severe, that pneumonia had worsened beyond what the hospital's limited resources could manage, but with proper care, there was still a chance. Richard listened, his jaw tight, then instructed the staff to move Anna to a private room and ordered whatever specialists were needed. Money, for once, was not about power or prestige, it was a weapon he would wield to save this woman because she was the only tether Lily had left. As the staff hurried to arrange the transfer, Anna turned her gaze back to Richard. Her eyes, though heavy with fever, carried a clarity that unsettled him. "If I don't make it," she whispered, her words breaking as she struggled for breath, "please, take care of her. Don't let her be alone." Her voice was faint, but the plea rang louder in Richard's ears than any boardroom demand he had ever heard. Richard's chest tightened. He wasn't used to promises outside of contracts, to vows that bound more than money. Yet as he looked at Lily, clutching her mother's hand with desperate innocence, he felt the weight of the request settle into him like a stone. He leaned closer, his voice firm despite the storm inside him. "I promise," he said. "She won't be alone. Not while I'm here." Lily glanced up at him then, her eyes wide, as if she had just heard something that might change everything. She didn't smile, not yet, but the grip of her tiny fingers on his sleeve grew stronger, as though she was already testing the truth of his words. Richard stood there between mother and daughter, the hum of machines filling the silence, knowing he had crossed a line he could never step back from. This was no longer about a simple act of kindness. It was the beginning of something that would alter both his life and hers forever. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm of hospital visits, late-night phone calls, and a gnawing sense of uncertainty that Richard could not shake. He had arranged the best possible treatment for Anna, sparing no expense, bringing in specialists who assured him they would do everything they could. Yet no matter how many consultations he paid for or how many state-of-the-art machines were wheeled into her room, there remained an unspoken truth in the way the doctors exchanged glances and chose their words carefully. They could treat, they could try, but they could not promise. Richard had built his entire empire on the foundation of certainty. He was the man people turned to when they wanted results, the one who made decisions with precision and confidence, but here in the sterile corridors of the hospital, he was confronted with something money could not guarantee. He began to spend his evenings at Anna's bedside, his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair, his tie loosened, while Lily curled up beside her mother, never wanting to leave. Sometimes Anna was lucid enough to speak in whispers, asking about her daughter, telling small stories from when Lily was a baby. Other times she drifted in and out of consciousness, her words slipping into incoherent fragments, and Richard felt the weight of helplessness pressing down harder with each passing hour. It was during one of those nights that social services appeared, uninvited but unsurprising. A woman with a stiff smile and a clipboard introduced herself, explaining that Lily's case had been flagged due to her age and her mother's condition. She spoke about procedures in foster care, her voice clinical and efficient, but to Richard it sounded like the cold machinery of bureaucracy already turning, preparing to swallow the girl whole. Lily, seated in the corner of the room with her teddy bear in her lap, looked up at the stranger with wide, frightened eyes. She didn't understand the words being used, but she understood enough. She clutched at Richard's sleeve, burying her face against him as though instinct told her he was the only shield she had. Richard felt his anger rise, though he kept his tone level. He informed the woman that Lily was under his care, that her needs were being met, and that any attempt to remove her would be met with immediate legal action. The woman faltered for a moment under the sharpness of his gaze, then recovered with a polite nod, muttering about evaluations and hearings before leaving. Richard knew she would be back. He also knew that this was no longer just about Anna's illness, it was about protecting Lily from a system that would treat her as a case file rather than a child. That evening, Anna summoned what little strength she had left to speak clearly. She motioned for Richard to come closer, her voice raspy but urgent. "She's all I have," she whispered, her gaze flicking toward her daughter who had finally fallen asleep in the chair, her small hand still clutching the teddy bear. "If I go, she'll have nothing." Her breath caught, and for a moment it seemed as though she might not finish, but then her eyes locked onto Richard's with startling intensity. "Promise me you won't let them take her. Promise me you'll be there when I can't." Richard felt the gravity of the request settle deep within him. He was not a man who made promises lightly, but when he did, he kept them. Looking at Anna, pale and fading, and then at Lily, fragile but fighting to be strong, he realized this was no longer a choice. It was an obligation he was already bound to, whether he admitted it or not. He leaned forward, his voice steady, each word carved with finality. "I promise. She won't be alone. I'll protect her, no matter what." Anna's eyes softened, relief washing over her features, and she closed them with a faint smile, as though his vow had lifted a weight from her. Richard sat back, his mind a storm of thoughts. He had never considered himself a father, had never even imagined the role, but something about the way Lily trusted him so completely, the way she leaned into him when frightened, had already begun to reshape his understanding of who he was. Later that night, after he had driven Lily home and settled her into a guest room in his vast, echoing house, he lingered at her bedside. She was so small in the oversized bed, her blonde hair spread across the pillow, her teddy bear tucked safely under her arm. For a long time he simply watched her breathe, realizing that the mansion around them, filled with priceless art and empty rooms, had never truly been a home until she stepped inside it. He whispered into the quiet, more to himself than to her, "You're safe now. I'll keep you safe." For a man who had measured success in numbers and contracts, this moment was unlike anything he had known. It wasn't about wealth or power, it was about a promise made to a dying mother and a child who had no one else in the world. And though he didn't yet know how he would fight the battles ahead, Richard Hayes knew without question that he would not let Lily slip through his fingers. The morning Anna passed away, the sky outside the hospital was a dull gray, heavy with the threat of rain. Richard arrived early, carrying a bag of pastries he thought Lily might nibble on, only to find the room filled with a silence that was thicker than any he had ever known. The machines that had once beeped steadily were silent, their cords already removed, their presence erased as though they had never been there at all. Anna lay motionless, her face calm in a way that suggested release rather than rest, and at her bedside Lily sat curled up in the chair, her face hidden in her teddy bear's worn fur. She did not cry loudly, instead, her body shook with the quiet sobs of someone too small to understand the permanence of death but old enough to feel its cruelty. Richard's chest tightened as he crossed the room, placing a hand on the back of Lily's chair. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, her cheeks blotched with grief. "She's gone," she whispered, as though she were confessing something she had done wrong. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair away from her tear-streaked face. "She didn't leave you, Lily," he said gently. "She wanted to stay. She loved you more than anything. But she's not hurting anymore." The words felt inadequate, yet they were the only truth he could offer. Lily buried her face against his chest, sobbing harder now, and Richard wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as though he could shield her from the weight of the loss pressing down. The days that followed blurred into a haze of funeral arrangements, whispered condolences, and the cold efficiency of paperwork that always followed death. Richard spared Lily from as much of it as he could, keeping her close, bringing her to his home where she slept in the room he had already begun to think of as hers. Yet no amount of distraction could completely erase her grief. At night she often woke crying, calling for her mother, and Richard would sit at her bedside, his hand resting on her small back until she drifted off again. Each time, he was reminded of his promise to Anna and of the unspoken responsibility that grew heavier with every tear Lily shed. It wasn't long before social services returned, this time more insistent, armed with legal documents and questions about custody. They spoke of procedure, of evaluations, of the need to determine the best environment for Lily now that her mother was gone. Their words were polished, professional, but to Richard they sounded like threats. He sat in his study across from the caseworker, Lily clinging to his arm, and listened as she outlined the possibility of placing the child in foster care while the courts deliberated. Richard's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively covering Lily's as she pressed closer against him. He spoke with the same authority that had once silenced boardrooms full of powerful men. "She is not going to a foster home. I gave her mother my word, and I intend to keep it. I will pursue full custody, and I will fight anyone who tries to take her away." The caseworker faltered, surprised by the firmness of his tone, but she recovered with a professional nod and left with a promise that the matter would be reviewed. When the door closed behind her, Richard felt Lily trembling beside him. She looked up at him, her voice small, fragile, and edged with fear. "Are they going to take me?" The question struck him harder than he expected, not because of its simplicity but because of the trust hidden within it, the belief that he might actually have the power to protect her. He crouched down so they were eye level, placing both hands on her tiny shoulders. "No, Lily," he said firmly. "They won't take you. You belong here with me, and I'll make sure of it." That night, after putting her to bed, Richard walked through the long, echoing halls of his mansion. For years, the house had been a monument to his wealth, filled with fine art and rare furniture, yet empty of life. Now, with Lily's drawings already taped to the refrigerator and her laughter echoing faintly down the hallways during brief moments of joy, it felt transformed. For the first time, the vast rooms carried warmth, even as uncertainty hovered over them. Standing in his study, looking out at the city lights, Richard understood that his battles ahead would not be fought in boardrooms but in courtrooms, where he would have to prove himself not as a CEO but as a father. And as daunting as the prospect was, he felt no hesitation. He had made a promise to a dying woman, but more than that, he had made a promise to the child asleep upstairs, and nothing, neither the system nor the weight of the world, would make him break it. The first court hearing arrived faster than Richard expected, and though he had spent his life in rooms where every word carried weight, he found himself strangely unsettled as he walked into the courthouse with Lily's hand clutching his. She was dressed in a simple blue dress he had chosen for her, her blonde hair braided neatly, but her eyes betrayed the fear she carried. Every step she took was small and hesitant, as though the building itself was something to be feared. Reporters waited outside, their cameras clicking furiously, eager to capture the image of a billionaire CEO entering a custody case that had already sparked whispers in the press. Richard ignored them, holding Lily's hand firmly, guiding her through the noise into the solemn halls where the real battle would begin. The courtroom felt colder than he expected, its high ceilings and wooden benches giving an air of judgment that pressed down on him as heavily as any financial deal ever had. On one side sat the representatives from social services, their files stacked neatly, their expressions detached and professional. They spoke of Lily not as a child but as a case, a responsibility to be shifted according to policy. Richard felt his jaw tighten as he listened to their opening statements, their voices calm as they argued that the child should be placed temporarily in the foster system until long-term arrangements were secured. To them, it was a matter of paperwork and procedure. To him, it was a matter of Lily's life. When it was his turn to speak, Richard stood, buttoning his jacket with a practiced motion, but his words were not delivered with the polished detachment of a corporate presentation. He spoke slowly, carefully, his voice steady but carrying a depth of conviction that seemed to surprise even himself. He told the court how he had found Lily, sitting barefoot in the cold, selling flowers so she could afford medicine for her mother. He described her bravery, the way she had refused to cry even when the night had grown unbearable, and how she had trusted him, a stranger, because she had no one else left. He explained that he had promised her mother he would protect her, that he had already taken her into his home, provided for her, and that removing her now would only deepen the wounds of loss she was already struggling to bear. As he spoke, Richard glanced down at Lily, who sat beside him clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide and locked on him as though drawing strength from his words. She looked smaller than ever in that vast room, her legs swinging above the floor, her shoulders tense, but when she caught him watching, she straightened just slightly, as if to prove she could be strong too. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable, and then, in a voice that carried both authority and gentleness, he asked Lily if she wanted to say anything. The room grew so quiet that even the shuffle of papers stopped. Lily hesitated, her fingers twisting the worn fabric of her bear, but then she rose from her seat, walking slowly to the front. Richard's heart ached at the sight of her standing alone before the bench, her small figure dwarfed by the towering judge's desk. Her voice was soft at first, trembling, but as she spoke, each word gained strength. She told the judge that her mother had told her to wait, that she had waited and waited, but her father had never returned. She said she thought maybe it was because she wasn't good enough. At that moment, her eyes flicked to Richard, and she added, "But he came. He didn't leave. He stayed. I want to stay with him." There was no theatrics, no rehearsed speech, just the plain, raw truth of a child who had known abandonment and found safety for the first time. The silence that followed stretched long, broken only by the faint rustle of the judge adjusting his glasses. Richard saw some of the officials shift uncomfortably in their seats, their polished arguments suddenly paling in comparison to Lily's simple plea. When she returned to her chair, she pressed herself against Richard's side, sliding her small hand into his. He bent down, whispering that she had been braver than anyone else in the room, and she gave him a faint smile through her tears. Though the judge did not deliver a final ruling that day, the weight of Lily's words lingered in the air long after the session ended. Richard could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, the quiet acknowledgement that this was no ordinary custody battle. As they left the courthouse, the reporters surged forward again, their questions sharp and insistent, but Richard barely heard them. He lifted Lily into his arms, shielding her from the flashes, her face tucked safely against his shoulder. She whispered into his ear, her voice so soft it almost vanished under the noise around them. I told them I wanted to stay with you. Was that okay? Richard kissed the top of her head, holding her tighter, and answered, that was more than okay. That was everything. That night, back at home, when Lily finally drifted off to sleep, Richard sat alone in his study, the events of the day playing over in his mind. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it would mean if the court ruled in his favor, not just the responsibility but the permanence, the transformation of his life into something he had never sought but now could not imagine giving up. The thought no longer filled him with doubt. It filled him with resolve. He had promised Anna, but more than that, Lily had chosen him, and he would not let the world take that away. The day of the final hearing dawned bright and clear, as though the world itself had decided to mark the occasion with clarity. Richard awoke before the sun, his mind restless but steady with a determination that had only grown stronger over the weeks of preparation. He walked quietly down the hall of his home to find Lily still asleep, her small frame curled beneath the blankets, her teddy bear tucked safely under her arm. For a long moment he simply watched her, realizing that whatever the outcome of the day ahead, his life had already been changed in ways he could never undo. She had taken up residence not only in his house but in the very core of who he was, and the thought of losing her filled him with a fear deeper than anything he had ever known in business or life. When they arrived at the courthouse, the air was buzzing with anticipation. Reporters gathered outside again, though Richard shielded Lily from their cameras as best he could, carrying her quickly through the throng and into the safety of the building. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but solemn, the weight of the decision ahead pressing on everyone present. The representatives from social services once again presented their arguments, speaking in calm, measured tones about procedure, long-term stability, and the importance of the system. To them, Lily's future was a matter of paperwork and precedence, not of promises or love. Richard listened quietly, his jaw tight, his hand resting firmly on Lily's shoulder as though anchoring her against the storm. When his turn came, Richard rose with deliberate calm. He did not rely on lawyers' polished words alone, he spoke for himself, and he spoke with a sincerity that cut through the formality of the room. He recounted again the night he had found Lily, barefoot and shivering as she clutched a box of daisies to her chest, a child carrying a burden far too heavy for her small frame. He spoke of her mother, of the promise he had made at her bedside, and of the ways Lily had already begun to transform under care and stability, her laughter returning, her trust slowly mending, her spirit shining in moments that revealed the child she was meant to be. His voice wavered only once, when he admitted that though he had built companies and commanded boardrooms, he had never been prepared for the responsibility of fatherhood, yet nothing in his life had ever felt so right as protecting Lily. The judge listened carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly as though weighing not only the words but the man himself. Finally, he turned to Lily and asked if she wished to speak once more. The courtroom hushed instantly. Lily looked up at Richard, her small hand gripping his tightly, and then, after a moment's hesitation, she walked forward. She clutched her teddy bear to her chest, her voice trembling but clear. She told the judge that her mother had told her to wait, that she had waited for her father but he never came back, and that she thought it was because she wasn't good enough. Then her voice broke slightly, but she lifted her chin and finished with quiet strength. But he came, she said, pointing back to Richard. He stayed. He's my family now. Please don't make me leave him. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Even the attorneys from social services shifted uncomfortably, their arguments paling in the face of a child's truth. The judge leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses, and for a moment Richard feared the decision would be postponed again. But then the gavel struck sharply, and the judge delivered his ruling. Lily would remain with Richard Hayes permanently. Custody was granted in full. The weight of the words hit Richard like a tidal wave. He felt Lily's small arms wrap around his waist before the echoes of the gavel had even faded, her tears wetting his suit jacket as she whispered, "I don't have to leave." Richard bent down, holding her tightly, his own throat thick with emotion. "No, Lily," he said softly but firmly. "You're home now. Forever." As they left the courthouse, reporters clamored once more, their cameras flashing, but Richard barely noticed. He lifted Lily into his arms, shielding her from the chaos, and carried her through the crowd with a calm certainty he had never felt before. She looked up at him, her eyes still wet but her expression lighter than he had ever seen it, and whispered, "Can I call you Dad now?" Richard pressed a kiss to her hair, his voice steady as he answered, "You already do." That evening, the mansion no longer felt vast and empty but alive. Lily ran through the halls, her laughter echoing off the walls, her drawings already pinned to the refrigerator, and a bouquet of daisies placed on the dining room table as a quiet reminder of where it had all begun. Richard watched her twirl in her new dress, the teddy bear still in her arms, and realized that for all his wealth, all his achievements, it was this fragile, miraculous bond, that defined him. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, he stood at her doorway, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. The promise he had made to Anna played once more in his mind, but he knew it was no longer just a promise kept. It was his life now, his purpose. The mansion that had once been only a monument to success had become a home, and in that home he had discovered a truth that shook him more than any corporate victory ever had. He was no longer just Richard Hayes, CEO and millionaire. He was a father, and he would never let his daughter be alone again.